Thank you very much indeed. Let me say that what I say this afternoon is not said on behalf or under the aegis of any of the organisations I have any connection with. They're all my own eccentric views. The trouble with people like me who sort of parachute in at the end of a meeting is that they don't really know what's gone before. So if what I say duplicates stuff that you've had earlier, do feel free to have a post-lunch nap. Time to do what is the question. And of course, it's really the problem that Mike just described, replace the obsolescent electricity generating capacity, and I say 20 to 40 gigawatts by 2080, and of course, the reason for 20 to 40 is that you went before specifying a number, you've got to specify what you're replacing it with. The second constraint is that simultaneously we have to meet very exacting government commitments to carbon reduction. And without going through all of these things in detail, you're aware of them. There are innumerable targets. But the most important point here is that the government is planning on most of the largest reduction coming in from electricity generation. And furthermore, they're not in China, not in Russia, they want to achieve this by market mechanisms. And those three together give the government, or give the country, a pretty exacting challenge. Now this is I'm sure you've seen pictures like this earlier in the meeting. It's a variant of what Mike showed a moment ago, with gigawatts of generating capacity plotted vertically, years plotted horizontally, starting in 2008. And what you can see is the lower solid straight line is peak demand, upper solid line is peak demand plus 20%. You always want some sort of headroom. 20% is probably a little generous. Many systems in the world actually operate with less than that, perhaps 15. But anyway, you need some headroom because some of your kit is going to go down for unanticipated reasons. Some has got to be taken out of service for maintenance and so on. So you do need headroom. And regardless of the predictions for demand for the future, the predictions about the reduction in generating capacity are pretty solid. And just as Mike showed, you can see that by 2020, we are going to be short of somewhere between 20 and 25 gigawatts of generating capacity. So that is the size of the problem. Let me digress for a moment here and say the reason that we are in a real mess is political. And I am, in the Lords, I'm a crossbencher, means I don't regularly support any political party. But first of all, part of the problem is dates back to Mrs. Thatcher's day, when she effectively destroyed our Department of Energy. And she did that with a rationale. She said we have two of the largest three oil companies in the world, based in the UK. They know what we need from an energy point of view. Why should we bother having more civil servants in the Department of Energy trying to second-guess them? So the Department of Energy was cut down to a relatively small room of people who basically looked after North Sea licenses. That was the Conservative contribution. The Labour contribution over the next decade or so is in fact, I think, more seriously bad and amounts to culpable negligence. In the 10 years before the present coalition came into power, we had 17, that is 17, changes of energy minister in 10 years. Now, no government that is taking energy seriously does that. And energy was not taken seriously in spite of innumerable warnings, as indeed Mike pointed out. And that is the reason that we are in the situation that we are there. So, against that, there is one new factor, and I don't know to what extent this has been mentioned, but that is shale gas. And I can, if you want to talk in detail about shale gas afterwards, I'm very happy to do so. But the important thing is that there are absolutely massive reserves of shale gas which have become available through a relatively recent combination of three technologies which themselves have been around for a number of years but have now been put together and refined, and it makes new reserves accessible. And the US, for example, appears to have 200 years of gas reserves now at current rate of usage. And there are reserves in other parts of the world as well. The other important thing, which stems from what I just said, is that shale gas appears to be widely distributed geographically. It's not the private province of a limited number of countries who are often, in some cases, not friendly to the West. There were certainly early environmental problems associated with shale gas. I think that these can be managed and will be managed. There are serious water demands associated with shale gas exploitation, and this may turn out, in some places, to be a limitation. But the price, my former colleagues in Shell tell me they believe that they can produce this at prices not much above or broadly comparable to that of existing natural gas. And like, of course, all natural gas, shale gas has roughly, it is the same composition as other conventional natural gas, and so you have roughly the half the emissions per kilowatt hour generated that you do from coal. And the other important thing is that because the US had had major contracts with the major gas suppliers in the Middle East, Qatar, the most important of these, and Qatar had established significant facilities for the liquefaction of natural gas, big export facilities. The US has now cancelled those contracts because, in fact, a couple of months ago, the US became, for the first time for a number of decades, a net exporter of hydrocarbons, as distinct from an importer that has been for a number of years. Now, the natural gas that was destined for the US is now going to be available for the rest of the world. Certainly China is going to take some of that, but it's certainly going to come to Europe as well. And this is welcome because it makes us much less dependent on Mr. Putin and the various pipelines that are coming from the east. The UK, for once, is at the right end of the pipe because we are very well established with liquefied natural gas deliquefying terminals, and we are going to be supplying through those trans-channel pipelines gas to the rest of Europe. And finally, I think one of the consequences of this availability of relatively cheap and relatively reliable gas is that there is going to be very little incentive for anyone to build another coal-fired power station in this country. I would be very surprised if they did. And it's worth looking at what this did to prices. Years plotted horizontally from 1989 over there up to 2009 here. And you can see the pale blue curve is gas, the orangey curve is oil, and the green one is coal. Now, you can see that gas was not terribly popular in the early 90s, but as it became more popular and people saw it as a way of decarbonising, those three curves come together. And about 2005, when LNG, liquefied natural gas, really came of age, you see that those curves begin to decouple. Coal and oil stay up there, but gas comes down. And that is pretty much where we are today. Obviously, those curves are still going to be influenced with spikes and hollows, reflecting national and international events, but that's what it looks like. And the other interesting thing is that if you now look at the price and the cost of energy in terms of BTU, bought, if you like, at $80 a tonne for coal, you're paying about $4 for MMBTU. At $80 for oil, and of course it's some time since oil was as cheap as that, you're paying around 14, and of course you're paying 4 for gas. So in fact, gas and coal become highly comparable. The differences are, of course, coal is easier to store. You just put a great pile there and sit out in the rain. It's relatively easy to transport. You don't need special ships. Gas, of course, you do need special ships, and it's more difficult to store. But the prices of energy there are comparable. Come back to this picture again, and there is 2020. And I said we were going to need about 20 gigawatts, and so that would actually get us up to somewhere in between those two black curves, supposing that they are right. And they're not going to be wildly wrong, but something of that order. Okay, so what is the government doing about this? Well, I have to say the present government has actually taken a number of initiatives in this respect. Obviously, I think if the government had a blank sheet of paper, they'd have done something different, but every government is to some extent prisoner of the policies which were adopted by its predecessors. So basically the government has got a large number of initiatives, probably too many, and I'm sure all of these have been talked about here, but smart grid meters are part of the topic of this meeting, and so I'll talk a little bit about my view of those, which may of course be wildly different from what has been said earlier. Take with meters for first. Well, obviously they avoid the costs of direct meter reading. They provide the fine detail of demand in space and time, very important. They facilitate a much more elaborate charging tariff structure, and they can allow consumers to optimize to low tariff use, and higher consumption awareness may also reduce waste. And the point is that only those two latter points there in orange are of direct benefit to the consumer. And as I'm sure you're aware and may well have been discussed, in some parts of the world there have been, been serious objection and resistance to the introduction of smart meters. And in this country, I'm sure all you need is one of the tabloids to say, the electricity companies, who are not necessarily the flavour of the month, anytime they're spying on you. And that will cause considerable difficulty. But one should be aware that the value to, or the obvious return to the retail customer is not great. If we go to the grids, there are a number of system and benefits, obviously. Incorporation of distributed renewables, bidirectional current flow, easier load following, if you've got the sort of information that smart meters give you. And this leads, of course, to reduced demand for new build, better information to generators, more efficient plant use, peak clipping, and so on. All of these good things come along. But as far as I know, and someone here may be able to tell me differently, there is no reliable or quantitative estimate of the benefits of this improved system. They will be positive, I believe, but it's not clear how much. So, what is the challenge for the UK? Well, we have a combination of a daily demand that varies by 50% and an annual demand that varies by a factor of 3. Just to illustrate that, and this diagram was simply going to show you the profiles, the average daily profile of demand in this country in the height of summer and the depths of winter. And what you see is in the, I'm sure someone else has shown a slide like this, in the summer the peak demand, or the lowest demand, is something like 22 gigawatts, and in the depths of winter it can reach 61, 62, 63. So it's about a factor of 3 difference over the year, and in any daily it can vary by a factor of 2. And this means that if we have significant amounts of intermittent renewable generation, which is not correlate, where production or generation does not correlate with demand, we have a problem. And so the 4th bullet point there at the top, we must be able to meet maximum demand without the intermittent with renewables, otherwise the lights will go out. And the economics of generation mean that nuclear really has to be run continuously for base load. And as is well known, this is because the costs of nuclear are all up front, and the operating costs are relatively minor. So if you've made the investment in nuclear, the smart thing to do is to run it continuously. Wind, you've simply got to use it when it's available, and that means that the load factor for a fossil fuel plant decreases as the proportion of intermittent generation increases. Just a fact of life. And this means that investment in flexible fossil fuel generation becomes increasingly unattractive as you increase the amount of intermittent supply, because you need more of the backup and it's going to be used less. So, new build in the market. This is one of the, if you like, this is the government credo that we have. Basically, the whole thing is going to be done by market mechanisms. That's fine, but you've got to use the market smartly. Now, unconstrained, the market would invest in gas plants, and would indeed have done so several years ago if government intentions had been clearer. And this is a point that Mike made a moment ago. Government policy is crucial to this. People were not sure of the government's policy over carbon, and so they just held back. There was a lot of competition for capital, for investors' capital. And if there's uncertainty in any one area, the capital goes somewhere else. So why would they have done this? Why would they have invested in gas plants? The lowest capital expenditure per kilowatt hour of any means of generating. So there is the lowest cost penalty if they're used intermittently to support wind, because a significant fraction of your gas costs is gas generation is the cost of your gas. And so if you don't operate the plant, you don't use the gas. And has the other benefit that if the gas price goes up, it's much easier to pass on to consumers. Quickest to build, easiest returns on investment, earliest returns on investment, and against the prospect of cheap and secure gas supplies. And, of course, the greenhouse gas burden is lower than coal. But market forces don't give you the best or the most appropriate solution. They give you the solution which is most easily financed. And it's very important to recognise that. In other words, it's got to be something that is understood by the market, by analysts, by investment houses, and appears to them to be relatively low risk. Now, it's appearances that we're talking about here, but that is the upper bullet there. The investment in gas plants is probably what would have happened in the absence of other factors. So the government has to introduce other factors, and we've actually touched on some of these earlier. And renewable obligation certificates, ROCs, CERTs, carbon capture and storage, giving R&D support, carbon floor price, electricity market reform, nuclear, endorsement of nuclear, all of these good things. And fundamentally, these are market nudging mechanisms, but they don't actually ensure delivery of any particular kind of system. And the question is whether any of these singly or in combination will be sufficient to accelerate low carbon and renewable investment sufficiently quickly, or indeed at all, I'm afraid. So what are my observations on this? Well, gas-fired power stations take, and I'm talking of gas-fired power station, perhaps 800 megawatts, something like that, take about 3 years to build. And comparable if you go a little bit bigger as well. That is ignoring planning time and things of that kind. And it makes various assumptions about the nature of the heavy construction industry market at the time as well. Nuclear build in the UK has been typically 10 years. But with massive planning support, it probably could come down to 6. The fastest construction of a nuclear plant that I know of, from breaking ground to first electricity, was in South Korea, and that was about 48 months. It doesn't have to take the enormous amount of time that we do, and so it could be faster. And so I've said with massive planning support, it could be faster. But that is starting today. The protracted competitive process for support of CCS and the Treasury's, if you like, relentless pursuit of value for money, even at the expense of actually procuring something which is obsolete, or by the time you get it, has meant that CCS is unlikely to be significantly deployed before 2020. And as Mike again pointed out, both CCS and offshore wind have major infrastructure requirements. And this problem simply has not yet been grasped. For CCS, you're going to need major infrastructure investment on land, pipelines effectively connecting the carbon sources to a collection point, and then probably to someone connecting those to somewhere on the coast, and then probably much less difficult connecting those out somewhere to a repository out at sea. For offshore wind, there are again comparable problems, probably not as serious, but comparable. But infrastructure, which takes time to build, and you can't just, the things that you need for these investments are not immediately off the shelf. You've got massive cable production requirements, pipe production requirements, and so on. It takes time, and it has to be planned, and that simply has not happened. And then just an observation, that the intermittency problem would be transformed by a cost-effective means of energy storage, which really has to be the holy grail of the energy research at the moment. And just to show a different example of wind intermittency and the challenge that it gives from that which Mike showed. This was wind variation in northern Germany. This is a slide from E.ON, Christmas 2004. And you have the Monday the 20th of December there, and you have Sunday the 26th there. Your vertical scale is in gigawatts generation, 1 to 6. And the important observation is that you go from Christmas Eve at the maximum 6 gigawatts down by 2 days later to 0, with massive gradients, 16 megawatts per minute on those steep slopes there. This is a real challenge. It gives you load following problems, but it also means that your backup really has to be ready. So intermittency, and I'm not against wind. I did 4 years as chairman of a wind company, and wind is really very useful, but it isn't a total answer. So what are my conclusions? The first is that practical and investment constraints suggest a maximum of 5 to 10 gigawatts of offshore wind will be connected by 2020. May not be that high. The second is that by 2020, neither CCS nor nuclear are likely to make a significant contribution. And the third is that demand management, smart grid, both helpful, but insufficient of themselves. And the fourth point is that most of the 2020 targets will be missed. I don't see how they can be hit. Gas is going to be available with a reasonable price stability, and a rushed and thus expensive gas-fired programme will get underway to keep the lights on. There really is going to be no choice. Most of the right things are happening now, but 5 years too late. Thank you very much.